The cameras had barely settled when the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Bright studio lights washed across the polished glass desk, bouncing off Wolf Blitzer's silver hair, catching the glint in his glasses. He leaned forward, his voice calm but sharpened, the kind of tone he had perfected over decades of commanding primetime news. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett's eyes locked in, unflinching, her expression carrying the quiet storm of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. Viewers across America leaned closer to their screens as Wolf pressed her, his words, not questions, but weapons. He spoke with that patronizing cadence of authority, the one designed to corner, to box in, to reduce his guest into a soundbite. For a second, it looked like Crockett might pause, play it safe, deflect like so many before her. But then something shifted. Her shoulders squared. Her voice cut through the studio air like steel sliding from its sheath. "Wolf," she began, calm but resolute, "the difference between what you're saying and what's actually true is the same difference between a headline and history. And I refuse to let you twist this into a headline." Gasps rustled through the audience just off camera, the kind that never makes it into the polished broadcast but is felt by everyone in the room. Wolf blinked, his practiced composure cracking for a fraction of a second. Crockett leaned forward, her words landing like hammer blows against the edifice of cable news control. Millions at home felt it instantly, that rare moment when the power dynamic shifted. The anchor, usually the untouchable arbiter, was suddenly the one on defense. Social media timelines froze. Phones lit up. A nation accustomed to politicians dodging, stalling, or pandering was watching something far rarer. Truth spoken without apology on a stage designed to silence it. The studio itself seemed to hold its breath. The air was heavy, charged, as though even the cameras sensed history bending in real time. Crockett's voice carried not just her defiance, but the echoes of communities long ignored. Families whose stories had been drowned out by the noise of the powerful. In that instant, the studio lights were no longer just lights, they were spotlights on a collision of two Americas. Millions were watching. No one expected what she said next. But to understand why this moment shattered prime time, we have to rewind. Rewind the tape, and the scene shifts from the electric silence of the CNN studio to the broader stage on which this clash had been set. It wasn't just another news segment. This was billed as a marquee moment, a primetime debate, a collision of worldviews framed as journalism, but charged with the energy of a political showdown. Millions of Americans tuned in, searching for clarity, bracing for fireworks, and unknowingly waiting to witness a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. Wolf Blitzer sat in his chair with the quiet assurance of a man who had spent decades shaping narratives. He was more than an anchor. He was a gatekeeper, a familiar face of the establishment who carried the weight of tradition, the language of authority, and the confidence of someone who rarely faced a guest willing to push back. For years he had dictated the tempo, interrupting, rephrasing, reframing. Few ever dared to flip the script on him. That was the battlefield Jasmine Crockett was stepping onto. Crockett knew what she was walking into. Prime time wasn't built for truth, it was built for theatre, for control, for reinforcing the same polished voices that had spoken over hers for decades. Yet she carried into that studio the stories of those who had been silenced, dismissed, or caricatured. She wasn't there for a headline, she was there for history. As the first questions rolled out, viewers could feel the trap being set. Wolf's phrasing was meticulous, each word carefully chosen to box her in. His eyebrows arched with the subtle performance of incredulity, his voice layered with the suggestion that her positions were radical, her perspective flawed. He wasn't just interviewing, he was sparring, his questions designed not to seek truth, but to corner her in front of millions. But Crockett didn't flinch. Every slight pause, every calculated smirk from Wolf was met with steady eyes and unbroken composure. She allowed him to pile on, to build the wall higher and higher, because she already knew what was coming. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, the stillness before the storm. And the audience felt it. On living room couches and glowing phone screens, progressives, immigrants, and everyday viewers who knew the taste of being dismissed leaned in closer. It was as if they could sense that Crockett wasn't going to simply play defense. Something in her posture signaled that she was building towards something bigger, that she would not only answer Wolf's challenges but dismantle the very foundation they rested on. This wasn't just about her versus him, it was about whose America would be heard in the next election, whose narrative would shape the future. Would it be the polished pundits who defined reality from behind studio desks, or the rising voices who carried the scars and strength of lived experience? Every word Wolf delivered raised the stakes higher. Every smirk, every interruption added fuel to the fire. The tension was no longer just between two figures under hot lights, it was a stand-in for a national question: whose truth matters? And as Wolf pressed harder, trying to seal the narrative with the authority of his primetime platform, the atmosphere in the studio grew heavier. Viewers could feel the countdown approaching, even if they didn't know what they were waiting for. Because what happened next would not only flip the script, it would ignite the kind of viral moment that rewrites careers and forces a nation to choose sides. To understand why the moment struck like lightning, we need to know the man sitting across from Jasmine Crockett. Wolf Blitzer wasn't just another anchor. He was a monument of television news, a fixture in America's living rooms for decades, a symbol of the mainstream establishment. His name carried the kind of weight that made politicians sweat before walking into his studio. For years, he had been the voice of authority, the one who shaped not only the questions but the answers themselves. On paper, his resume sparkled. Decades at CNN, countless interviews, breaking news coverage that spanned wars, elections, and scandals. To many, he represented the polished face of journalism. Calm, steady, serious. But to his critics, and there were many, Wolf embodied something darker: the arrogance of an elite media machine that claimed objectivity while protecting power. His critics said he rarely spoke truth to authority because he was authority. And it wasn't hard to see why. Over the years, Wolf had perfected the art of the loaded question. He would tilt his head, arch his brow, and with a single phrase, reduce a politician's policy into a trap, a caricature. The power wasn't in what he said directly, but in what he implied that the guest sitting across from him was already guilty, already discredited, already a step behind in the game. Most played along, trying to claw back dignity in a game rigged from the start. Wolf thrived on that imbalance. It wasn't just about informing the public, it was about reminding guests that they were in his house. The studio, the lighting, the cameras, the pacing, everything was designed to tilt the stage in his favor. Few ever dared to flip the script because doing so meant risking humiliation or worse, career suicide. Behind the calm exterior was a man who knew his power and wielded it with precision. When Wolf smirked, it wasn't an accident. When he interrupted, it wasn't impatience. It was strategy. He understood the psychology of the camera. A flustered guest made for good television. A silenced truth made for a tidy narrative. But the cracks were there if you knew where to look. Younger audiences no longer saw him as the untouchable sage of news, but as a relic of an old system, polished, rehearsed, out of step with the raw, lived realities of the people actually shaping the future. Critics whispered that Wolf's brand of journalism was less about truth and more about control. He wasn't holding power accountable. He was protecting it, packaging it, selling it back to America as reality. And that was exactly the energy he carried into the night Jasmine Crockett sat across from him. He saw her not as an equal, not as a rising force, but as another politician to press, another headline to wrangle, another clip to dominate the news cycle. He underestimated her. He thought he could use the same tactics, the same tone, the same arsenal of subtle dismissals. But he didn't know the woman sitting across from him wasn't built like the others. She didn't play defense, she didn't cower before establishment voices. Crockett wasn't there to play Wolf's game. She was there to rewrite the rules. And that is where the villainy comes in, not the moustache-twirling kind, but the quieter, more insidious version, the arrogance of someone so comfortable in their power they believe no one could ever stand up to them. Wolf represented not just himself, but decades of media gatekeeping, decades of voices being cut short, decades of stories being twisted into something they were not. He was the polished mask of control. For Wolf, this was just another night under the studio lights. For Crockett, it was something far bigger. This wasn't just about answering his questions, it was about exposing the game itself. The villain never sees their downfall coming until it's too late. And as Wolf adjusted his glasses and prepared his next line of questioning, he had no idea that the moment that would define the night, and perhaps his career, was already in motion. Because across from him sat a woman who had studied the traps, who knew the weight of being underestimated, and who had been preparing her entire life to tear down exactly what Wolf Blitzer represented. And the first strike was coming. To see why Jasmine Crockett's words cut through the air like a blade, we need to step outside the studio and trace the path that brought her to that table. Because Crockett wasn't born into privilege, nor was she handed a polished platform with easy access to America's primetime screens. She fought her way here, step by step, through grit, sacrifice, and a relentless refusal to be silenced. Her story begins in the heart of Texas, in communities where opportunity was scarce but resilience was plentiful. Crockett grew up surrounded by families who worked harder than anyone should ever have to, only to be dismissed by the very systems meant to serve them. She learned early what it meant to be underestimated, to have people assume she didn't belong, to have her voice treated as background noise. That sting of dismissal wasn't just personal, it was generational, woven into the fabric of every classroom, courthouse, and office where doors quietly closed to people like her. But Crockett didn't back down. She sharpened her mind like a weapon, studied harder, pushed further. She earned her way into the courtroom, becoming not just a lawyer but a defender for those who couldn't afford polished advocates. She stood up for people who had been trampled by bureaucracy, ignored by politicians, and steamrolled by the kind of arrogance embodied by men like Wolf Blitzer. Every case, every client, every moment in the courtroom was another brick in the foundation of the woman who now sat under the blinding lights of CNN. In those early days, the courtroom was her battleground. Judges tried to talk over her. Opposing counsel underestimated her. She heard the whispers, the condescending tones, the subtle racism and sexism that told her she didn't belong. And yet, case after case, she proved them wrong. She learned to strike not with volume, but with precision, to use silence strategically, to wait, to watch, to let her opponent tie themselves into knots before she delivered the devastating line that cut through the noise. That skill set was born of necessity. In rooms where everyone assumed she had the least power, she discovered her greatest strength, turning doubt into fuel. And over time, those victories, small and large, built a reputation. She wasn't just another lawyer. She was the one who wouldn't back down, who wouldn't soften her edge, who refused to let injustice slip by unchallenged. Her journey from the courtroom to Congress was far from smooth. She faced smears, doubts, dismissals at every stage. Opponents tried to caricature her, to paint her as too loud, too brash, too unpolished for the halls of power. But Crockett leaned into it. She knew that the very qualities they mocked were the ones her community valued most. Honesty, fire, and the courage to confront corruption head-on. By the time she arrived in Washington, she was already a symbol. Not the polished symbol of compromise, but the raw symbol of resistance. And with every committee hearing, every exchange caught on camera, her following grew. People saw themselves in her immigrants who had been silenced, young women who had been ignored, working-class families who had been dismissed. She carried their stories into rooms where they had never been allowed to speak. And that is why the confrontation with Wolf Blitzer carried so much weight. Because for Crockett, this wasn't about trading barbs with an anchor. This was about showing America what happens when the underestimated finally speak without fear. This was about reminding the millions who had tuned in that they too could stand their ground. Her very presence in that studio was an act of defiance. CNN wasn't built for voices like hers. Primetime wasn't structured to amplify truth spoken with raw conviction. And yet, there she was, leaning forward under the glare of the lights, ready to face a man who represented decades of dismissal and control. It wasn't arrogance that powered her, it was preparation. Every hardship, every courtroom battle, every sneer she endured had trained her for this exact moment. Crockett didn't stumble into this clash, she had been forged for it. She carried with her the rhythm of the courtroom, the passion of protest, the clarity of someone who had no intention of letting another man define her story. And perhaps most importantly, she carried her community on her shoulders. The pride of Texas, the grit of the working class, the determination of those who had been silenced for generations. When she spoke, it wasn't just her voice, it was theirs. And that's what made her dangerous to Wolf Blitzer and everything he represented. Because when someone like Jasmine Crockett sits across from the gatekeepers of power, the game changes. The questions aren't just questions anymore, they're opportunities to expose the very mechanics of control. And the answers aren't just answers, they're declarations of survival, dignity, and defiance. So when Wolf leaned back in his chair, ready to press her with the same old tactics, he had no idea that every step of her life had been preparing her for this exact moment. The courtroom battles, the congressional fights, the whispers, the smirks, the dismissals, all of it had sharpened her into a weapon of truth. And as she sat there, eyes locked on him, calm but unbreakable, the stage was set for a collision unlike anything prime time had seen before. The moment of escalation was coming, and this time, Wolf Blitzer wouldn't be the one in control. The studio hummed with the low tension of lights, cameras, and silence waiting to be filled. Wolf Blitzer leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on the desk, wearing that familiar mask of control. His voice cut through the air, smooth, authoritative, sharpened with the edge of skepticism. He lobbed his questions, not as invitations to explain, but as traps disguised as dialogue. "Congresswoman," he began, the word rolling off his tongue with just enough emphasis to remind the audience of hierarchy, "your critics say your stance is not only unrealistic, but reckless. How do you justify pushing policies that even members of your own party are hesitant to support?" It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the subtle tilt of his head, the slight rise of his brows. To the untrained eye, it looked like curiosity. To those who knew better, it was condescension, a performance perfected by decades behind the anchor desk. Crockett didn't answer immediately. She allowed the silence to linger, her calm composure clashing against Wolf's urgency to dominate the exchange. The pause itself was a challenge, a reminder that she wasn't going to dance to his rhythm. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, precise, a counterpoint to his performance. "I justify it," she said, "the same way every working American justifies fighting for their families by knowing the stakes are too high to back down." The crowd murmured off camera. Wolf smirked, quickly regaining his footing. He leaned in again, this time cutting her off before she could expand. "But Congresswoman, that sounds good on paper," he interrupted. "What about the math? The experts say—" Crockett's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. She let him talk over her, stacking his interruptions like kindling. She knew the fire would burn hotter once she chose her moment. Viewers at home felt the rising tension. This wasn't a debate, it was a duel. Every time Wolf spoke, he tried to corner her into the role of the radical, the reckless challenger to the respectable mainstream. Every time Crockett waited, measured, and responded, she pulled the audience back toward her side. Then came the turning point. Wolf leaned back with that practiced sigh, his glasses sliding down slightly, the hint of a grin tugging at his lips. He asked the question designed to finish her. "Are you saying, Congresswoman, that you know better than the experts, better than the American people who think you're going too far?" It was the kind of question that left most guests flustered, scrambling to soften their words or reframe their positions. Wolf had used it 100 times before. It wasn't meant to elicit truth, it was meant to shame, to reduce, to corner. But Crockett didn't scramble. She didn't soften. She leaned forward, eyes locked, the faintest smile playing at the edges of her lips. The weight of the moment hung heavy, as if the whole studio knew what was about to happen. Because this was it, the instant she had been waiting for. The trap was set, but it wasn't hers, it was his. The audience held its breath. Phones hovered above couches, ready to clip, to tweet, to post. Every second of silence felt like the drum roll before the cymbals. And then, with the calm precision of someone who had been underestimated her entire life, Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth to deliver the line that would shatter the illusion of Wolf Blitzer's control. The silence before Jasmine Crockett spoke was thick enough to touch, the studio lights burned down like interrogation lamps, and Wolf Blitzer sat with the practiced half-smile of a man who believed he had already won. His question still hung in the air, dripping with the arrogance of finality. "Are you saying, Congresswoman, that you know better than the experts? Better than the American people who think you're going too far?" It was a question designed to end her. But instead, it became the moment that defined her. Crockett leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk, her eyes never leaving Wolf's. There was no panic, no hesitation. She let the pause stretch, long enough for viewers at home to shift in their seats, long enough for Wolf's smug certainty to curdle into unease. And then, with a voice that carried the calm power of inevitability, she answered. Standing before a small crowd the very next day, Crockett addressed the moment with the same composure she had shown on live television. "What happened last night wasn't about me, and it wasn't about Wolf," she began, her voice carrying not the sharpness of a clapback, but the steady warmth of conviction. It was about who gets to tell America's story, and who gets silenced in the process. She spoke of her upbringing, of the lessons passed down from family who taught her that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, is the most American act of all. She reminded listeners that democracy doesn't belong to the polished few behind studio lights, but to the millions whose labor, sacrifice, and struggle keep the country alive. Every time we accept the narrative that justice is too expensive or dignity too radical, we surrender a piece of ourselves, she said. And I won't surrender mine. The crowd erupted, not with the roar of partisan triumph, but with the deeper resonance of shared identity. For immigrants in the audience, her words echoed their own journey, the daily act of proving worth in a country that too often forgets its roots. For working families, her message validated the long hours, the overlooked contributions, the unshaken hope that their children could live with more dignity than they had. The media had tried to frame the clash as spectacle. Crockett reframed it as a lesson. That arrogance, no matter how polished, collapses in the face of integrity. That silence, no matter how heavy, can be broken by a single voice refusing to bow. And that America's strength has never come from the gatekeepers, but from the people who keep knocking until the door finally opens. Online, the clip of her speech spread almost as quickly as the takedown itself. Hashtags shifted. What began as Crockett vs. Wolf evolved into "We won't surrender." It was no longer about a debate in a studio, it was about a movement in the making. Crockett closed with words that would be quoted for weeks. If you remember anything from that exchange, remember, this dignity is not up for debate. Justice is not negotiable. And no matter how loud the voices of doubt get, they will never outlast the voices of the people. Her message landed not as an ending, but as an invitation. People walked away not just entertained by a viral clash, but inspired to claim their own space in the story of America. And yet, even as the applause settled, there lingered the question of what would come next. Because moments like these do not exist in isolation, they either fade into memory or ignite into movement. The country was about to decide which path this one would take. The lights in the CNN studio had long since dimmed, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words refused to fade. Across the nation, living rooms, classrooms, and community halls replayed the moment, not as a clash between a politician and an anchor, but as a reminder of what happens when truth refuses to bow to power. This wasn't just about Wolf Blitzer. It wasn't even just about Crockett. It was about every voice that has ever been told to sit down, to wait their turn, to soften their edges for the comfort of the powerful. Last night proved that those days are numbered. And here's the truth. The story doesn't end with a viral clip. It continues with us, with the people who share it, discuss it, and draw strength from it. Each view, each conversation, each repost is more than engagement. It is a declaration that dignity belongs in the spotlight, and justice is worth fighting for. So, if this moment moved you, if it made you feel seen, heard, or reminded that courage still has a place in our politics, don't let it pass quietly. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it with you as proof that arrogance can be confronted, that silence can be broken, and that the story of America still belongs to those who dare to speak up. Because Jasmine Crockett may have torn down a wall on live television, but it's up to all of us to build what comes after. Subscribe, stay engaged, be part of the movement. Because the fight for dignity isn't over, and the next chapter is waiting to be written.